Hi there, and welcome to a special edition of Power Play on this Tuesday. I'm Vashi Kapelos, live this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are, from Banff, Alberta, just down the way from Canada-U.S, where day 2 of the G7 summit is wrapping up without U.S. President Donald Trump. He left last night, he says, to attend to issues in the Middle East. Here's a look at how the day unfolded without him at the table.
It's a sign of the maturity, I think, of the G7 that we come together for common problems in energy security, common opportunities in new technologies. We are providing additional military assistance, drones, helicopters, broader munitions, over $2 billion worth of assistance directly to Ukraine.
We are ready for the peace negotiations, unconditional ceasefire. I think it's very important, but for this we need pressure.
The fact that you decided to bring Canada to the 2% spending when it comes to NATO this year is really fantastic.
You saw some of the bilateral meetings Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney held today. I am told that in moments he is set to sit down with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a high-stakes and very controversial meeting happening ahead of a press conference the Prime Minister is scheduled to hold in just about 90 minutes' time. I want to bring in my colleague, our senior political correspondent here at CTV, Mike Couture, who is over in Canada-U.S. watching all of these developments as they unfold. So, Mike, this meeting with Prime Minister Modi wasn't supposed to happen until after the press conference, which kind of we all had our eyebrows raised, thinking, oh, we can't even ask about it at the press conference. But this is a big deal of a meeting. Explain why.
Yeah, it really is, especially when you consider the history between these two countries. It wasn't so long ago when it wasn't clear whether or not Narendra Modi would be welcome in Canada because of these accusations that we're seeing from the RCMP tying his government and elements within his government to homicides and extortions in this country. This is something that the Indian government has refuted in the past, but to have this conversation and to have this sit down, I think a lot of people at this summit were thinking, well, if it's so late at night, could it be that this summit will go much later and then this may not even happen? Well, understanding from that we are getting from Canadian officials is that they are moving the schedule to have that meeting earlier, and as you said, in moments. And the question I think a lot of people will have on their minds is whether or not Prime Minister Mark Carney will bring up these allegations, even though it was just about a week ago, Vashi, that a number of journalists who had asked Mark Carney about the invitation of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the G7, about whether or not it was appropriate. And he had said at the time that, look, we have had more conversations with the Indian government. We know that law enforcement are having these conversations together and trying to make sure that there is this coming together of the two sides to work together on these types of cases and to make sure that they do have these types of conversations in a way of respect and in a type of format like this. May be the right time, but certainly at that media availability that we're going to have from Mark Carney, after that, there will be questions as to what was said and what the tone was between the two leaders.
Yeah, fair to point out, even people within Mark Carney's own caucus, so some Liberal MPs who represent certain constituencies in this country, had come forward and met with him to express their concern about the Prime Minister being here and ask him, Prime Minister Modi, that is, and ask him to raise these, the allegations and whether or not we can expect India to fully cooperate in an investigation. So I'm very glad to hear that we're going to get reporters, we're going to be able to have reporters ask those questions of the Prime Minister. Let's switch to another kind of international crisis, which took up a lot of the day. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky attended much of the G7 today. And then there was, an announcement specifically from Canada, but no joint statement from everyone around the table. What can you tell us about what you're hearing behind the scenes about why that is?
Yeah, a senior government source did tell reporters that there was expected to be a joint statement on Ukraine and Russia. Unclear exactly what the statement would be. We are told to look for clues of it in the chair statement, and that is a statement given by the person who was chairing this meeting, Mark Carney, at the end of the summit, when in lieu of a final communique that everybody signs on to, and is essentially Canada's position. It's not going to say these countries agreed to this statement in this way, but it certainly will be a clear indication of what they had hoped would be in that statement. We're hearing from Canadian officials that they were working towards something and they did have hope as late as last night that they could come to some agreement. Now, the people who represent leaders at these summits are called Sherpas. They are the ones that do all of the heavy lifting ahead of the summit. From what we understand, many of the Sherpas believe that they could get to some sort of agreement, but it was being watered down by the American side. And it's believed that that was happening because of the position that the Americans are in, trying to broker some sort of a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. So that is what we are hearing right now from the Canadian side, that it will come instead from the chair's statement. They won't tell us exactly what part of the language the Americans disagreed with, but it's interesting when you consider that Donald Trump had left last night after the dinner, that they were still working on something and still had some hope that they could come to some sort of agreement, Vashi.
Okay, thanks so much, Mike. Our senior political correspondent, Michael Couture, up in Kananaskis. One of the bilateral meetings that U.S. President Donald Trump was to have today was actually with President Zelensky, along with Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum, Both of those meetings, the latter especially, pretty relevant when it comes to the free trade agreement between all three of our countries. Speaking of that, Donald Trump did leave last night. He said to attend to what's happening between Iran and Israel, and there's a lot to discuss on that front. As he was on the plane, though, headed back to the United States, he spoke more about what had taken place between himself and the Prime Minister and where things stand when it comes to a potential new trade agreement between Canada and the U.S. Take a listen to what he said to reporters.
And you said a lot about acquiring Canada as a state. Did anybody talk to you about that? And where
I think it's a much better deal from Canada, but it's up to them. They're going to have to pay a lot of tariffs and things. They're going to have to pay a lot of money for the dome, for the Iron Dome. They want to be a part of it. We may make a separate deal on that, by the way. We discussed that, with the dome. That may be a separate deal. They want to be at $71 billion. They're going to pay.
So following all these bilateral conversations between Canada and the U.S. here at the G7 and what you just heard from the president, where does that leave things with a potential trade agreement? Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey is my guest. Hi, Governor. Pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to welcome you to our program. Thanks for making the time.
Great to be with you.
I'm coming to you today from Banff, Alberta, not too far from where we were yesterday. The president and the prime minister had a bilateral meeting lasting about 40 minutes. At the conclusion, the Canadian side released sort of a press release or a statement saying that their aim was, collectively, they had agreed to reach a deal on trade between our two countries in the next 30 days. What are your thoughts on the possibility of that and what it might mean to your state?
Well, it's very important that a deal be reached. I mean, I can tell you, coming from the state of Massachusetts, but speaking really on behalf of the Northeast region of the United States, the relationship between Canada and the United States is just so deep. And we in Massachusetts and across this region so appreciate it. And we have for decades, centuries, the trade relationship, the cultural relationship, the familial relationship. I mean, 1 in 5 New Englanders have French-Canadian origins, if just to put a point on it. And what we've seen in frankly President Trump's doing has been to totally disrupt those relationships, those familiar relationships, cultural relationships, economic relationships. It's a mess that the President of the United States has created, and we need to have that fixed. We need to have things made right. We need to have a normalcy when it comes to economic engagement, because we're hurting for it. Our states are hurting for it. And I know that the Canadian provinces are hurting for it as well. So we need to have a deal, and I hope that one is reached soon.
Can you expand on the disruption part of what you mentioned there and the impact that you have seen thus far on your state? Can you quantify what that disruption has meant for people who live there?
Absolutely. I mean, already because of what has happened, we're seeing real drops in tourism. New England states have seen drops in tourism between 20 and 60% from Canadian visitors. I know that flights into and out of Logan Airport here in Boston to and from Canada are down considerably from last month. And so that obviously has a huge economic hit to our region. We've seen the impact of tariffs. They've totally disrupted supply chains. They've increased the costs of goods. That's not good. I'm a governor focused on building more housing in Massachusetts, and with tariffs, the cost of soft wood, soft lumber has gone up, and that's not helpful to my goal of building more housing. And then I think about energy. The estimated impact of tariffs alone is about $2.5 billion, 2.5 billion US dollars. That's the additional cost that these tariffs are going to be on energy costs for people in our area. So, this is just bad all around. And those are just some of the many anecdotes and figures that we've been hearing about. And I can tell you, it's across all of our states.
Right. And I actually want to pick up on that point, because I know that you and some of your counterparts in other states spent the past few days meeting with Canadian premiers. Our Prime Minister has said the relationship as we knew it, from an economic interdependence viewpoint with the United States, is over. Do you think if a deal is arrived at that, things could go back to what they used to be?
I think they can, and I think they must. They should. But I appreciate what the Prime Minister is saying, because unfortunately, President Trump took action that has been harmful to American residents, harmful to American businesses, and obviously also harmful to the relationship between Canada and the United States. But one thing that I did in the face of all that, in the midst of all of it, was to say, hey, wait a second. We have Massachusetts and other states. We have such long-standing ties. So I arranged the other day for New England governors and the governor of New York to come to Boston along with Canadian premiers to talk about the things that we could do together on trade, on tourism, on energy, and to affirm and reaffirm our genuine commitment to the great people of Canada and our desire to see things normalized. This is not right, what has happened. And, as a governor of Massachusetts and as a representative of the United States, I want to be clear with the people of Canada that there's nothing more than most all of our residents want than to see the normalcy of relationships restored. Canada is our number one trading partner, has been a key ally and friend, more than anything, friend for so long to our states. And those are ties that, while frayed and tested, and they have been, need to be restored, need to be shored up. And that's why I took that action as governor. And I was just so happy to be able to host the premiers and have the conversation about what is in everyone's mutual interest. And my only hope is that I'm sorry that President Trump had to leave the G7. I hope that they can quickly get to work on finalizing and working towards a deal that restores the important relationship that exists between the United States and Canada. But I also understood, listening to the premiers, how real the anger is, the resentment, the fear, the feeling of betrayal on the part of Canadians towards the United States government, and in particular Donald Trump, for what has happened. And our message is from here to say we want to continue those relationships. Canadian-U.S. friendship means a great deal to all of us. Important trade relationship, important economic relationship, and that's something that we want to see restored. And I hope that Canadians still come to Massachusetts and visit this part of New England.
Do you ultimately, Governor, think that the president will be, I guess, moved off of the approach he's taken, particularly with respect to tariffs? He kind of stated at the outset that the idea was to use them as almost like a blunt force instrument to force other countries into making deals. And to be fair to him, that appears to be, particularly where I am right now, what's happening. There are lots of countries, including mine, who are lining up to make new trade arrangements with the United States. Given that, do you think there's anything that will ultimately actually force him off that approach?
Well, he has to do something because our economy is suffering for it. Our businesses are suffering. Our residents are suffering. And, we're paying more for just about everything as a result of his tariffs. So, if he's listening to people and the American people, if he's listening to business, then he will come off of that and change course. And, it is my hope that he does listen and that a deal is reached, an agreement is reached with Canada and with others out there, because this is killing our economy. We don't need this in America right now. And residents are paying for it, Americans are paying for it, and frankly, our businesses are paying for it.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Governor, thank you so much for making the time for the conversation. I appreciate it.
Sure. Good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
That's the governor of Massachusetts, Maura Healey. Moments ago, some brand new video coming into our newsroom that we want to share with you. Prime Minister Mark Carney has now held that bilateral meeting with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. I'm going to have you take a look at the video and listen in to the Prime Minister's initial comments.
Very good. May I say, Excellency Prime Minister, it's a great honor to host you at the G7. India has been coming to the G7, I believe, since 2018 in Biarritz with our French partners, and it's a testament to the importance of your country, to your leadership, and to the importance of the issues that we look to tackle together, from energy security, from the energy transition that you're helping to lead, to the future of artificial intelligence, to the fight that we have against transnational repression, against terrorism, against other factors, and the work that we can do together. And it is my great honor to have you here. I enjoyed your intervention just now, and we look forward to our discussion.
एक्सेलेंसी मैं आपका बहुत बहुत आभारी हूँ कि आपने G7
All right, that's Prime Minister Mark Carney meeting just moments ago with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. A lot of anticipation heading into this bilateral meeting, given, of course, what has happened over the last year and a half. Mark Carney's predecessor, Justin Trudeau, stood up in the House of Commons at one point accusing the Modi government of being behind the murder of, or being linked to, I should say, the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil, allegations that the RCMP said that they could provide some substantiation for. And as a result, a number of Indian diplomats, very high profile in nature, were kicked out of this country. The relationship between India and Canada since then at a total impasse, free trade discussions put on hold indefinitely. And then about a week ago, the Prime Minister extended, or just a little further, the Prime Minister of this country extended an invitation to Prime Minister Modi to attend the G7. Members of his own caucus were not thrilled at the prospect and asked him to raise the allegations that were being made. We don't have word yet on whether or not that was the case, whether or not the Prime Minister asked his counterpart in India to fully participate in the investigation that is taking place. But those questions certainly will be directed at Prime Minister Carney next hour when he holds a press conference in Canada-U.S, Alberta, at the closing of this G7 summit. We'll have a lot more to dissect coming up on this special edition of Power Play, live from Banff. After a very short commercial break, our special coverage continues after that break. Stay right there.
Great honor to host you at the G7. India has been coming to the G7, I believe, since 2018 in Biarritz with our French partners, and it's a testament to the importance of your country, to your leadership, and to the importance of the issues that we look to tackle together, from energy security, from the energy transition that you're helping to lead, to the future of artificial intelligence, to the fight that we have against.
Welcome back to a special edition of Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos, live in Banff, Alberta. That meeting between Prime Minister Mark Carney and his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi took place just moments ago in Canada-U.S on the sidelines of the G7. It's a highly anticipated meeting with a lot of domestic scrutiny. Here to talk a little bit more about the ins and outs of our relationship with India is Jody Thomas. She's a former national security advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Hi, Ms. Thomas. Good to see you as always. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you for having me, Vashi.
I remember when we were in the depths of sort of covering the allegations against India, and just for our viewers who will be well familiar with them, but former Prime Minister Trudeau had stood up in the House of Commons alleging that the Modi government was tied to the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. I remember at times the federal government saying that you were making trips back and forth to India to try and secure cooperation in the investigation that was going on. Given what you experienced and what you know about this, how big of a deal do you think this meeting is that just took place?
Oh, I think it's a really significant meeting, and I think it's really important that it happened. The criticism of Prime Minister Modi coming to Canada for the G7 has been significant. However, you do have to have dialogue for things to improve and for us to get to the bottom of what happened. And so that he was there, but that Prime Minister Carney took the time to have a bilat. I imagine that it was a very direct conversation, I think is really important and a critical step forward for the relationship between the two countries.
Given what you know about what did happen or the allegations that the government and the RCMP were leveling, what sorts of things do you think would have been important to bring up in that bilateral meeting?
Well, first of all, I think Prime Minister Carney probably asked for India to make a statement not dissimilar to the one they've made about cooperating with the Americans. I think that's first and foremost a really important acknowledgement for the Indian government to make. Secondly, I don't think it was accidental that Prime Minister Carney mentioned transnational repression in his readout that you just clipped in front of Prime Minister Modi. Canada will not tolerate what happened on Canadian soil. Certainly a murder is egregious in its extreme, but also transnational repression of citizens, foreign interference, electoral interference. And I think so those elements are really important. And I suspect that Prime Minister Carney raised that. Additionally, I don't think we are back to having a full diplomatic complement in India. We removed a number of diplomats when I was still the NSIA. Returning to our proper level of diplomatic engagement, I think, is really important because the people-to-people ties between our two countries are so important for our trade, for our economic growth. And so I suspect his intervention with Prime Minister Modi was on the diplomatic elements, the investigative elements, and on trade elements.
We also removed a number of diplomats whom the RCMP said were connected in some way to other illegal activities. I'm wondering, from your perspective, if you think it is possible to restore that diplomatic relationship without an explicit statement, as you had just sort of mentioned, from Prime Minister Modi about cooperation, because the criticism certainly from, for example, Liberal Sikh MPs whom I've interviewed over the last few weeks is that that has not been explicit from Prime Minister Modi, and that's why they felt so uncomfortable with his visit.
I think it is a necessary step. I do think that we can return to a trade relationship without that, but I think there will always be an element of mistrust without some acknowledgement from the Indian government itself. Could be people within the apparatus. I'm not sure it has to come from Prime Minister Modi, but I think it does need to happen. And I think we need the acknowledgement that they will work with us the same way they acknowledged they would work with the Americans.
Do you think, based on your experience, even if they do say that, we should trust that they will?
I think it will be very difficult. Our standards of evidence are completely different between the two countries. The RCMP has been working for years to try to get to the bottom of some issues that India has raised with us, and it's been difficult. Our expectations of another democratic nation are perhaps a little different than what they believe they should have to share with us. So the conversations are complex, there is no doubt. I think that the level of trust will take years to rebuild, but it has to start. And it is critical that India is at these conversations as the rest of the world is talking about economic growth and national security and sovereignty issues, when they are the major player in the Indo-Pacific, and they are a major player in our sort of challenges with China. And so we do have to be practical. But I think that the expectation that India understand the damage they have done here in Canada is really important to moving this relationship forward.
One final question for you about kind of reconciling that practical aspect of what you laid out and the sort of economic imperative vis-a-vis what's going on with Donald Trump, but also, against the backdrop of trying to move away, for example, from China. CSIS has a new report, right? Their annual report, which again spells out what you have said, what Justice Og said, that India is a big concern when it comes to foreign interference. And I'm not even just talking about transnational repression, I'm talking about a whole host of other activities. How wide should our eyes be, or how open should our eyes be, pardon me, if we are going to amplify our economic relationship with India?
Our eyes need to be very wide open. And I would say that the Department of Foreign Affairs, the National Security Apparatus, CSIS, other departments, the RCMP, certainly very aware and attuned to what is going on in a way that perhaps we've never talked about publicly before. And certainly that was one of the things Justice Hogue raised. You have to talk about it. You have to be very open with disclosing what's been found and working with the other country to stop it. And so Justice Hogue's findings, really relevant, really important as we move forward. I think transparency is critical to all of this. We in the national security community, or those who are still working in the national security community, need to be given the ability to speak about what's going on in a way we never have. And so I think that report was useful, and I think it's timely, and I think it just confirms everything that we've known and should give confidence to Canadians that the security community and those who are working to protect us understand what's happening in this country and are doing what they can to stop it.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Ms. Thomas, thanks for your analysis. Appreciate it as always.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jody Thomas is former National Security Advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We'll take a quick break here on Power Play from Banff, Alberta. On the other end of that break, so much to break down with our front bench. Brian Gallant, Ronna Ambrose, Tom Mulcair, and Colton Prale will join me looking ahead to the Prime Minister's press conference next hour. Back in a moment.
We had a lot of good talks with a lot of people.
You said he's looking for something more complex. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Well, they get too complex in the deals and they never get done. And we need speed. We're dealing with, really, if you think about it, probably 175 countries. And most of them are going to just be sent a letter saying, it'll be an honor to trade with you, and here's what you're going to have to pay to do it.
Welcome back to a special edition of Power Play from Banff, Alberta. That is U.S. President Donald Trump last night on Air Force One after he left the G7. Surprisingly, after the first day, he said he had to do so after a productive day, he called it, to attend to matters in the Middle East, namely what is going on between Iran and Israel. Lots went on between Canada and the U.S., including advancing the prospect of a new trade pact between our two countries. The two leaders agreed to a 30-day timeline to do so. Let's talk about that with our front bench. Here tonight with me, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's the CEO now of Space Canada. Ronna Ambrose is a former leader of the Conservative Party and Deputy Chairwoman at TD Securities. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us. And next to me here in Banff is CTV National News correspondent Colton Prale. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Brian, I'll start with you on the prospect of this agreement in a month. How likely, do you have a gut feeling about how likely that is? I think that they wouldn't put a timeline on it unless they thought it was possible.
I agree. I also think we've all heard rumors that we actually would have a deal that would have been imminent, even maybe before the G7, or to be announced at the G7. So those rumors obviously weren't substantiated, but I think it gives us a sense that things were moving and progressing fairly well. They probably were cautiously hoping that they'd be able to maybe do it before or announce it at the G7. So with this, I think them getting together, they can see it as sort of this was a big milestone. Not sure it was. Maybe it was helpful. Not sure to what extent, though, because it did sound like things were moving in the right direction over the last week or so, maybe 2 weeks. So 30 days seems pretty realistic, I think. And as you mentioned, certainly you wouldn't put a yardstick out there if you didn't have the intention of hitting it. That said, you can certainly have someone like President Trump do that to essentially try to put pressure on Canada. But it seems like with the tone that he had leaving the G7, I think he certainly seems to have enjoyed his time with Prime Minister Carney yet again. So not sure that's why they would have done it. So it sounds like it's rolling and it's going in the right direction.
If I understand the imperative in particular from industry and business, Rana, throughout the country, it's stability, right? The idea that even though we can't necessarily trust Donald Trump because of what he's done with NAFTA or CUSMA or USMCA, ultimately we need some sort of framework for stability moving forward. If in fact there is still a level of tariff, because it doesn't sound like Donald Trump is going to be anything but a tariff man and to some degree, if there's some level of tariff, is that stability still achievable?
Well, I mean, I think business always talks about certainty. And so even if there is a level of tariff that we have to live with, at least there's some ability to start thinking about how do we work around this? How do we relocate? How do we certify more of what we do under the USMCA? I mean, there's strategies that at least business, once we know what we're dealing with, can employ. We know that Trump is a tariff man. We know that we are trying our best to achieve free trade. And in that scope of discussions, I think the other thing we have to remember is there's also some security and defense concessions discussions happening, which adds a layer of complexity to all of this. And perhaps with our announcement of reaching our 2% target for NATO contributions, upping our defense, all of these things make a difference in the larger negotiations. But I think what I've heard from industry, the tariffs that are hurting the most right now is the steel and aluminum, and those aren't even part of what's happening with the USMCA. So the hope is that it's just a leverage like Trump used in the last round of negotiations. And hopefully, if we can get past what's happening with the USMCA, he will lift those. But I think we do, to his point about having some type of tariff on almost every one of these countries that he talks about, 175 countries, but even allies and strong partners. I think we could have to face the reality that there might be some level of tariff.
Tom, this G7 is coming to an end in about an hour. The Prime Minister is going to hold his press conference. So far, it doesn't appear to have gone south like the one in Charlevoix did when it comes to Donald Trump and the rest of the group. But he did still leave, right? He left after a day, which we only found out about, I think it was 5 o'clock Eastern, something like that. And it was, yes, to focus on what's going on in the Middle East. But there were some big bilateral meetings he was supposed to hold today, for example, with President Zelensky and President Sheinbaum of Mexico. What does it say to you that he did leave?
Well, I think that Donald Trump, for once, should be given a little bit of slack about leaving, because I do think it's a pretty serious situation in the Middle East right now. The United States has moved 30 aircraft into Europe that could be used in an attack. Let's hope and pray, literally hope and pray that that doesn't happen, because things could quickly get out of hand. And I don't sense that Trump wants to go there, and I know that the MAGA world doesn't want to, but it's there, it's on the table. So the actual meetings themselves, I have to say, have gone quite well, despite the fact that Trump did leave after a day. He stayed for that first full day, and some stuff got done. He did not get a chance to talk with Zelensky. He probably included that in his calculation of when to leave, because we saw the worst attack ever by Russia last night. And the way Trump has been talking to Putin for hours at a time, leaves one wondering whether or not there was some idea of what was going on here. It's very worrisome. But I think that overall, I think that Carney showed that he's able to invite the world to get these things done majestically and beautifully, flawlessly, despite the departure of Trump. Sometimes the tiny details cut him up. Just to give you an example, at the 4 p.m. hour Eastern time, they were setting up their final round. Stephen Harper had a habit. Anytime he was in that sort of event, he would speak French first, so he didn't have to remember about adding something in French at the end. I was doing a French panel show, the main French network, private network, and Mr. Carney gave a great explanation without a single word of French. And the host of our show immediately picked up on it. Well, we've just heard Prime Minister Carney do this whole explanation for this final round without speaking a word of French. So that's the type of tiny detail that the folks around him are going to have to work on. The big stuff, he got right.
I'll definitely concede, Colton, to Tom's point. It is pretty majestic here. Not often that we're doing our little talks in front of mountains and the beautiful scenery of Banff, Alberta. What is your sense of the degree to which, though, Trump's absence today kind of influenced the way things went. Ultimately, like, he was seen to be someone who didn't necessarily agree on Ukraine or on a host of other issues. So de facto, will we see consensus otherwise on those things? But we didn't really end up with that either.
Well, that's just it. We didn't end up with consensus in the end. And despite all the concerns of a G6+1 scenario, especially with conversations around Ukraine, you then have this afternoon sources in the Prime Minister's office briefing reporters on why they can't put out a joint statement on Ukraine. You ask yourself, did you accomplish what it was that you desired at the start of this? This was supposed to be a core pillar of the entire summit. You invited Volodymyr Zelensky here, and at the end of the day, yes, bilaterally we saw progress, and yes, the UK unveiled new sanctions on Ukraine as well, but was this worth it for Volodymyr Zelensky? He didn't get his one-on-one. How fruitful can you have discussions around a lasting peace or a ceasefire if Donald Trump's not there? And you still had the US president saying things that could have been verbatim from Vladimir Putin, whether that was with regards to the G8 yesterday or his comments around Ukraine today. It still wasn't really progressive. And at the end of the day, if this was going to be such a significant portion of the summit, I'm left wondering if they can truly feel that there was success in that element to it. And it's a question I've put to the PMO multiple times today, and not once have we got a clear answer on that front.
Okay, well, stand by for that. We will add this small caveat that Canada announced an addition, quite a bit of extra support for Ukraine from a military perspective and alone, but I certainly take the point that you're making. Okay, I've got to take a quick commercial break. The entire front bench is sticking around. On the other end of that break, we'll talk about the Prime Minister's meeting with his Indian counterpart, and then look ahead to his press conference, which is slated to take place, I think, a little bit later than expected, but sometime in the next few hours. What kinds of questions will Mark Carney get? We'll talk about that next. Stay right there.
Excellency, Prime Minister, it's a great honor to host you at the G7. India has been coming to the G7, I believe, since 2018 in Biarritz with our French partners, and it's a testament to the importance of your country, to your leadership, and to the importance of the issues that we look to tackle together, from energy security, from the energy transition that you're helping to lead, to the future of artificial intelligence.
It's Prime Minister Mark Carney and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi meeting a little bit earlier this hour, a highly anticipated meeting ahead of the Prime Minister's press conference, which will take place a little bit later next hour. I'm here with the front bench to talk about both of those things. Brian Gallant, Rana Ambrose, Tom Mulcair, and Colton Prell. Rana, I'll start with you. We just heard a little bit of a snippet kind of at the outset of that meeting from the Prime Minister. Do you think it was the right call to invite Modi to Canada? And how do you anticipate they're going to navigate all the blowback?
Yeah, can you hear me, Vashi?
Yeah, I can hear you great.
Okay, great. I think it was the right thing to do. Look, there's the relationship has been troubled. There's been some sort of, scandal on our side, but really the real substantive issues were what happened with the Indian government in Canada, accusing with, legitimate evidence behind the accusations and allegations about the assassination of a Canadian on Canadian soil, with the potential involvement of the Indian government. That was obviously a huge change and a huge shift in the relationship. Offense was taken. We still don't have a complete. Our diplomats are still not back in India the numbers they used to be, and as well here in Canada on the Indian side. So there's a lot of repair to make, but I think it's important because, look, from a point of view of ensuring that India stays on the side of the G7 and on the side of the Western world, with sharing whether it's diplomatic ties or economic ties with countries that share our values, is important. We know that there's a strong relationship between India and Russia, India and China, and as much as we can continue to make sure that it has close ties to countries like Canada, I think that's positive. I think economically, India is one of the big targets for Canada when we talk about diversifying trade away from China. We do very little trade with India, and yet India is a federation. India shares many of the same democratic values, and yet and it's a massive market, and yet we're not trading with it as much. So we've got a lot of repairing to do. India has a lot of repairing to do with us, but I think that's underway. Some statements that have been made have been helpful, but there's still some work to do. In terms of domestic politics here in Canada, the Khalistani community, look, I don't know if you saw them as you drove out to Banff, but there was hundreds, if not more, hundreds of cars, maybe several hundred protesters along the highway ready to greet Prime Minister Modi. So there's also a big domestic political issue, and of course for legitimate reasons on both sides that Prime Minister Carney would have had to address. So, prickly situation for him as a Prime Minister, but I think he did the right thing in starting to repair the relationship. And we have to expect that Prime Minister Modi is a signal that he is also trying to repair the relationship.
Tom, Rana mentions the protests, and she's right, they're quite substantial between Calgary and Banff. I think they're also reflected by members of the Prime Minister's own caucus who, in a very civil way, expressed their concern about about the presence of Prime Minister Modi, and asked him to raise certain things and explicitly sort of get the statement from Modi that they will cooperate with any investigation. Do you anticipate the Prime Minister has to address that tonight, the degree to which he did or didn't sort of raise that with Mr. Modi?
He'll do it obliquely. He's not going to say that he has a deal with the Indian government for this or that, but I do think that it's going to be necessary for Mr. Modi to put something on the table that Canada can explain to Canadians, because the Sikh community is very upset and frankly very worried. It was a surprise to see Jagmeet Singh back in the picture, but he reminded people that he had been put under guard by the RCMP because of threats that they believe could have been coming from the Indian government. So this is real for Sikhs living in Canada, and they want to be able to express their views like every other Canadian without fear. But it's mostly the problem at its base, I believe, Vashi, is how this came about. Mr. Trudeau used this on the first day of Parliament. He was down in the polls. This was something big that was going to draw attention away from his polling numbers and from everything else. And he hit it so hard and he hit it so bluntly that the Indian government took great offense and was able to almost position, at home anyway, itself as the victim here. The Americans had to deal with something almost identical. They had clear evidence of an attempt by agents of the Indian government to try to assassinate someone, an American, on American soil. It didn't happen in the States, but they didn't go over the top. They dealt with it through the normal, tough diplomatic channels, which is not what we did. So I think that there's been errors on both sides, us in the way we dealt with it. The Indian government, of course, if it does turn out to be the case, as evidenced by the findings of Madam Justice Ho, that the Indian government was involved. So I think that it's both at the same time, and it is an opportunity to start mending fences, because Carney put out a paper just before the G7 reminding everyone that this was one of the main objectives was new partnerships. And you can't talk about an Indo-Pacific trade relationship if you don't have India involved. So Canada's looking for those new partnerships. India is absolutely part of it. And that's why we have to be the adults in the room in dealing with this.
Brian, your thoughts on that?
I think my esteemed colleagues make lots of good points and really, I think, clearly illustrate why this was a difficult one. I tend to agree that I think it's important to try to restart the relationship. And I think Rona's absolutely right to say that both are signaling they're willing to do that. And look, every country, not every, but almost every country that you deal with, there are arguments as to things that people have said or done, or history that you could basically say to yourself, well, we want to be careful on this topic or not meet with the person at all. And I think at the end of the day, you have to kind of weigh the risks and benefits. You have to weigh the way in which you think this will help your people. And again, maybe the geopolitical considerations at play, and weighing all of that, especially given it is still in a process at the moment. I think weighing all of that, it makes sense. I won't repeat what my esteemed colleagues mentioned because I agree with almost all of their points. So I think that they lay out again what was being weighed, and we just kind of paraphrasing Rona, but I mean, look, India is a counter to the rise of China. I mean, they're going to be incredibly important for the Western blocs and for Canada specifically, if we can mend that relationship. But again, as I think Tom did very well to point out as well, that's not easy to do given recent history. So certainly the two getting together, I think, is a good thing. And obviously it's a way to try to restart things. But if we find that process and ultimately in more information, more concrete information, more allegations, we'll certainly see on a panel, all of us discuss and try to weigh all of it again with more information.
Last 30 seconds to you, Colton. How do you what questions, I guess, do you anticipate the Prime Minister gets on this and more broadly the summit tonight when that press conference happens?
How do you balance those two priorities, both defending Canada, not only with regards to the RCMP investigation, but also foreign interference, while also taking advantage of what is the fastest growing economy in the world? And two, is it worth it? Is it worth it in your minds to push aside potentially some of the concerns that exist here in Canada in order to bolster economic relations with India?
I'm very curious to see if he adds more meat to the bone, because in that first press conference after he announced the invitation, Prime Minister Carney kind of deferred all questions around those allegations to a legal process unfolding. So it'll be interesting to see if there's more specific answers tonight. I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, everyone, for a great discussion. As always, I appreciate it. Our front bench, Brian Gallant, Rana Ambrose, Tom Mulcair, and Colton Farrell. More of our special coverage just ahead after a short commercial break. Welcome back to Power Play. We're in Banff, just down the road, a little bit further maybe, from Kananaskis, where the G7 is wrapping as we speak. Prime Minister Mark Carney meeting with his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi a little bit earlier this hour. That meeting, a very high stakes one, widely anticipated, or highly anticipated, I should say, because, of course, of the allegations Canada had previously leveled at the Indian government that they were behind the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. This was the first meeting between the two heads of government that had taken place since those allegations were leveled. We anticipate that there will be a number of questions to Prime Minister Carney when he holds a press conference at the top of the next hour about what exactly he raised in the meeting. Did he, for example, talk about the allegations or secure any kind of commitment from Prime Minister Modi that India would cooperate in the investigation into those allegations that is taking place? Those questions will certainly be directed at the Prime Minister, as well as a whole lot more about how this summit went down and what happened with Donald Trump. I'm going to leave Power Play there. Thanks so much for watching. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow in Ottawa. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.